May 1961. The United States gets a man in space, 3 weeks after the Russians. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth once in a 108-minute flight. Alan Shepard's suborbital flight lasts 15 minutes. In Huntsville, Alabamians celebrate. They helped build Shepard's Redstone rocket. But what next?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
To meet the goal, these Alabamians would have just over 8 years to design, test, and build a rocket 100 times more powerful than the Redstone. They would have to create the most powerful machine ever made. Its engines would rock the Tennessee Valley during test firings. Its flame would flash across the Alabama hills. The Saturn V, made at Alabama's George C. Marshall Space Flight Center, would send man to the moon.
President Kennedy committed us to go to the moon by the end of that decade, which was some 3,000 days later. Didn't have a long time to start looking, how do we go to the moon? And we just put a man in suborbital. He didn't even go in orbit, up and down, ballistic flight.
Huntsville, Alabama, a small cotton town, famous only as the watercress capital of the world, when a U.S. Army base is established there during World War II. In 1950, Redstone Arsenal would become the home of a group of extraordinary German scientists.
And much had transpired to bring about the creation of the Marshall Organization. From war-torn Germany to Fort Bliss, Texas, to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, a young German rocketeer named Dr. Werner von Braun and a team of scientists and engineers were to do much to advance rocketry in the United States. Working for the United States Army, the von Braun team had tested and further improved the V-2. The team, bolstered by American rocket scientists, developed the Redstone missile, and under the direction of the newly formed Army Ballistic Missile Agency, modified the Redstone to boost Explorer-1, the free world's first Earth satellite, into orbit on January 31st, 1958.
Thousands of Alabamians were now working in Huntsville's aerospace industry, and Werner von Braun championed space exploration.
No question about this. He was very diplomatic in his work, and after we had the successful first orbiting satellite, Explorer-1, then his aim was clear. We should go further with higher payloads and see that we can obtain finally a vehicle that would go to the moon.
In 1960, most of von Braun's German team and his civilian workers were transferred from the Army at Redstone Arsenal to NASA's new George C. Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. One of its first visitors was the new president.
He came down and spent about a half a day here, and I know Dr. von Braun turned on the charm and used his persuasive talents, and I'm absolutely convinced that that was why President Kennedy decided it was feasible, that he was a guy who could pull it off, who had gone far enough already to determine feasibility and to prove feasibility, and that he could trust Werner von Braun to get that rocket ship to the moon.
In fact, some people, maybe even including myself, we had some doubts that we really could design a brand new launch vehicle, the Saturn V, which we knew would be needed in order to land on the moon, and that all the testing and all the development still could be done in that decade.
Well, I was very concerned because we didn't have a big rocket. We had done some preliminary studies on how we would go, and so I knew it was going to be a big engineering challenge.
During the early satellite programs, the payload weight was expressed in pounds. But a new program was being considered that would lift tons into space. The possibility of a large, clustered engine first stage for a space vehicle seemed possible. Various configurations were considered. A decision was reached. It was to be called the Saturn program.
President Kennedy had given NASA a deadline, not a roadmap. There was no plan to get to the moon. Von Braun's team wondered if the mission could be accomplished with the Saturn I, the biggest rocket that was ready to fly.
Well, initially von Braun thought in order to do it in this short period of time, in that decade, so that left us only about 8 years to do it, he would have preferred to improve the Saturn I, which was already ready for some relatively early launches at that time, and to use a number of Saturn I's and do some assembly in Earth's orbit.
Headquarters wouldn't make a decision. They had the university, had science committees, all kind of folks helping us, so-called helping.
The plan using existing vehicles wasn't feasible. The voyage to the moon would require a new, more powerful rocket, the huge Saturn V.
With the vision of the future clearly in focus, there was no doubt the United States was headed for the moon. It would take a tremendous national effort to accomplish such an ambitious project.
Federal money poured into Huntsville. The workforce mushroomed. People from all over the nation joined Marshall in the space race. Lee James was working for the Army when von Braun convinced him to come to NASA.
As you might know, since he moved him and all of his laboratories to NASA, everything was headed by a German-born person. And this began to bother von Braun. He didn't have the American interface that he needed. So one day I was out in the back of my yard over the bluff of my mountain where I was on the mountainside there, and I saw him climbing down to meet me. And I said, "What's up?" He says, "Lee, we've got too many Germans running things. How about joining us?"
I was interviewed by one of the German team, Dr. Heller, and he was looking for a woman because he had engineers and draftsmen, all male, and none of them liked to do the ink drawings. And so he thought if he could get me, that would be fine.
Machinist Ed Beresford was one of the first Americans to join the Germans at Fort Bliss in El Paso. They had just arrived in the States. He moved with them to Huntsville.
Well, the first thing the GIs taught them was how to swear, and boy, they could swear a blue streak. Matter of fact, they had to go over to the main office and apologize to a lot of the women for things they said that just shouldn't have been remarked.
What I did basically, I became the director of the Materials and Processes Lab at that time, and we were developing the new alloy to use in the Saturn V, the 2219 aluminum. It was, at that time, the highest strength and highest strength with the lightest weight.
Margaret Hap Brennecke, a metallurgist with the Aluminum Company of America, moved to Huntsville to help the Marshall team figure out how to weld the new aluminum alloy. She was one of the first women to work there as an engineer.
And when the space program came into being, I guess I got hooked. And I applied, and I was accepted at Marshall Space Flight Center, which of course where I wanted to go, because that's where they were involved in the actual manufacture of hardware.
New construction began. New test stands grew into the skies, a symbol of the dynamic space program of the future. Office facilities were built to accommodate the dedicated people who would accomplish the ambitious program objectives that lay ahead.
You were talking in the mid-60s between 7,000 and 7,500 civil servants, a huge workforce, and that does not count the number of contractors on site here.
The team was in place. The mission plan was set. The laboratories, offices, and test facilities were occupied as soon as they were constructed. But Marshall's chances for success relied heavily on one man, Wernher von Braun.
I think the concept of going, what it would take to do it, I have to attribute a lot to von Braun.
Well, he was more than an engineer, but he might have been that rare quality of a statesman, a politician, and an engineer. But he was certainly a first-class engineer, and I think equally capable of selling his ideas. He did that very well.
Even in the early days, sometimes he would come in and on my drawing board to ask about a little chart I might be doing. So he took a real interest in everybody, I think, that worked for him.
But I think he was the spark plug that kept it on that time frame and kept it on track. He was very good at inspiring people.
I never saw anybody that met him who didn't like him. He was a remarkable person.
Over these busy years, we have, of course, been joined by many from across the nation, to the point that what has been done has truly been an all-American job. It has been an atmosphere of cooperation, resourcefulness, and enterprise.
He was always one to encourage people to do their best and apply themselves, which was a great atmosphere.
He knew when to manage, when not to manage. That's a great thing, I think. He knew when to let his people manage, and that's something not many people know how to do. He was very good at what he did, I think. I was very fond of Von Braun. We were very close.
He was a good guy just to be around. He loved people. People loved him, and you knew right away his credibility. I mean, people would accept that.
The Saturn V is the free world's largest launch vehicle. It was started in January 1962 when NASA authorized Marshall Space Flight Center to design and develop a very large and powerful launch vehicle. The Saturn V is designed to place in Earth orbit a payload of 250,000 pounds, or send a 98,000-pound payload to the moon. It stands 365 feet high, weighs, when fueled, 3,100 tons, and consists of 3 propulsive stages and an instrument unit.
Alabama workers at Marshall had to sort out thousands of problems before the Saturn V was ready for launch. Innovative techniques were developed to work on new materials.
Once or twice we had the program stopped entirely for a few weeks when we just couldn't weld, for instance, the bulkheads. Those are ends of the tankage. We were having difficulty doing that.
To weld the dome, or the lid if you want to call it, onto this thing, to go around that 33-foot diameter tank in one continuous operation was really tricky and was a challenge.
It's no big deal today with the emphasis on equality that we have, but back then, for a woman to make her way in a field like welding, which, you know, you imagine guys in leather boots and helmets and leather gloves for the most part, and she was right out there with them, I'm telling you. She mixed with them.
But it helped by having a nickname of Hap, because you can't tell whether it's a he, she, or an it. And I always signed everything just with my initials.
Every part, every component, every system was rigorously tested. The Germans had developed this philosophy in their amateur rocket societies before the war.
So Von Braun learned during his very, very early experience that, as you indicated earlier, there are so many possibilities of failure with the many, many parts you have, that you have to do everything you can in order to be sure that all these potential problems have been ironed out in static testing.
Test, and they would never say launch if they didn't believe it, because they're very careful about that.
If we had a valve that was going to work maybe just 10 times during the mission, we cycled 50,000 times to make sure it was going to come back.
Massive test stands at Marshall held down the rockets while they were fired. When the 5 new specially developed F-1 engines were ignited, fire and smoke filled the sky, shock waves rolled over the land, and the noise thundered across North Alabama.
It is an awesome video. I saw that. It was some test. It's a terrific thing to see 7.5 million pounds go off like that.
So it was a very loud noise. It rattled not only the air but also the ground. So part of the noise was transmitted through the ground.
All over the valley here in Huntsville, you could hear those, and there were jokes made about, well, nobody's complaining about it because it makes the cash registers jingle.
7 F-1 engines were delivered this quarter by the prime contractor, Rocketdyne. Instrumented to allow study of vibration levels, one of the engines was used to further substantiate the feasibility of cross-country truck transportation for F-1s instead of air transportation. The truck-transported engine arrived at the Marshall Center in excellent condition after its 2-week trip from the Rocketdyne Canoga Park, California plant. A total of 56 F-1 engines have now been delivered to NASA, including those for the first 7 Saturn V flight vehicles.
After the static test, the rockets graduated to dynamic test. The entire Saturn V was rattled and vibrated on a specially built stand to see if it could stand the stress of flight.
At the Marshall Space Flight Center, stacking of the Saturn V dynamic test vehicle was completed early this quarter with addition of the instrument unit, spacecraft adapter, and Apollo spacecraft. This artist concept illustrates how the Saturn V dynamic test vehicle appears when fully erected inside the dynamic test stand. Configuration 1, or full vehicle testing, began after completion of stacking. The vehicle was vibrated by electrodynamic shakers to determine the bending and vibration characteristics the vehicle will be subjected to during flight. This bending and vibration data is required to verify the adequacy of guidance and control systems design. Several minor irregularities indicating the need for possible engineering changes were discovered as a result of Configuration 1 testing during this period, and additional tests in these areas will be conducted next quarter. Configuration 2 testing, which includes testing the entire vehicle, minus the first stage, will then begin. The purpose of this test series is to verify guidance and control design for conditions which will be encountered after first stage separation.
But the clock was ticking. The conservative nature of von Braun's team, requiring test after test, was costing NASA precious time. President Kennedy's challenge might not be met. So instead of separate launches testing each of Saturn V's 3 stages, NASA urged the Marshall team to prepare an all-up first flight. The 3 stages would fly together on the first flight.
That was almost against the principle of the von Braun team, because they were very methodical, they tested very much, and there was this argument about should we really do that or not, and he finally decided yes, it would be the thing to do, because if we wanted to do it in this decade, you almost had to resort to that strategy.
That is correct. We all would have, because that was our tradition, that we tested step by step. Of course, the steps were relatively large. For instance, we would have preferred to fly first the first stage active, then add the second stage, and finally the third stage.
November 1967. The Saturn V, designed and built at Alabama's Marshall Space Flight Center, is ready for launch at Cape Kennedy. This flight will have to succeed if President Kennedy's challenge is to be met.
I was very confident with the support we had, also financially from NASA headquarters, that we would be able to make it.
I think most of us thought we've got to make it work. And we've got to make it work in a timely fashion. So, let's say instead of thinking of obstacles, you try to think of challenges, and boy, I'm going to beat it. We're going to make this work.
But there was always that great enthusiasm of everybody involved. We just never felt for a minute like we wouldn't be able to pull it off, even in the most difficult times. When we ran into welding problems, we had other things that slowed the program down once or twice, even stopped it. We still knew we were going to get there. There was no hesitation.
The launch wasn't flawless, but it was still a spectacular success. In fact, there was never a launch failure during the entire Saturn program.
You're right, yes. It was amazing to us too that we had in no way any failures.
And that is still the best record today. No other vehicle project has the same record. They all had, initially at least, a number of failures. And I think that is due to von Braun's insistence on testing on being sure that everything works all right, doing even a lot of mathematical studies in order to find out where the problems are and maybe do already something in the design phase for a maximum of reliability.
We never lost a Saturn. Never lost a Saturn, and I think that's amazing. Millions of parts and no failures.
The moon landing was still 20 months away, but much of Marshall's work was done. Though the Saturn V was designed in Huntsville and the first models of the rocket were built there, contractors took over the production of later vehicles at sites around the nation.
The date? Christmas, 1968. Apollo 8, with astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders, the first men to reach lunar orbit. The realities of the long-sought goal were within our grasp.
On Apollo 8, astronauts orbited the moon. On Apollo 11, they would land on it. And the mighty Saturn V, the product of Alabama's scientists, engineers, welders, machinists, clerks, secretaries, and thousands of other workers, would make it possible.
Von Braun used to say, he jokingly said that, and if I can paraphrase it, was that we ought to put a tag on the vehicles that were built in Alabama, made in Alabama by Alabamians, because we had done so much of the work and so much of the design here at Marshall. So he was very interested in making sure that Alabama got credit for the work that was being done right here in the state.
It's an awful tense moment when you first ignite that bottom stage, because then the thrust is not that much greater than the weight till it burns off some of that. And it goes up awful slow. I can remember some that seemed awful slow to me.
I love to hear that racket when that thing went off. When you see that missile go out of sight, you knew your parts was doing what you had hoped for.
You know, to see that, because we're talking about 7.5 million pounds of thrust when all this is going on. Real thrill, real thrill. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I mean, I almost got tears.
Oh, it was extremely emotional. It was my father who really died a few months after that, was 92, and he came up to my house to watch on the television with me. And between us, we talked about the amazing life he'd had and reaching a space age where things were going to happen, unbelievable things.
I never did breathe. In fact, I didn't breathe till he got to the moon, was down, and was coming back, okay?
I was at the television set like it was my own brother landing up there.
Yeah, every time I look at the moon, you know, it's still hard for me to believe, and I guess there are people around in the world who don't believe it, but it's still hard to believe we actually did that. That was quite an accomplishment.
That happens still very, very often, particularly if we have a full moon, but even on a partial moon like we had last night. I looked up again last night and was thinking of this adventure. And in my book, it's the greatest event that happened in this century.
I look at those ridges and hills up there and think about landing between them on flat ground. Terrific. It's an awesome spot to see that moon up there bright, full. And whenever it's full, I get a great feeling out of it.
My wife says I'm a pack rat, and I got stacks of stuff that NASA passed out and other people didn't pay much attention to it at the time. But I saved that, and I knew one of these days when I was just mostly going to sit here in the ham shack and I can go through my thing, and it brings back a lot of memories. A lot of the Germans that are gone now, I can still hear them. But they were a good group.
I certainly never dreamed as a child in Ireland someday that I would be working with people and being a part of going to the moon. There's just no way I would have thought of that.
It was a challenging experience, and some of us were lucky enough to be there and to be involved in something that went beyond yourself.
3 million parts, 6.5 million pounds, thrusted by 7.5 million pounds of booster down there. It's quite a beast, and we're real proud of what it did. It took a lot of work. We had a lot of good engineers out here at Marshall, and a lot of good contractors, and without them, I never could have made it.
I remember one time, I'll make a last remark here. Von Braun says, you know, he said, about 2020, something like that, he said, maybe we'll all get to go up there and see what that moon looks like. But of course, 2020, there won't be many of us that was dreaming back then and be able to go.
Videotape copies of this program are available by calling 1-800-463-8825. Learn more about this and other programming from the Alabama Experience on the web at www.alabamatv.org.